You're listening to episode 324 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. John Danvers joins us to speak about the in-person Exeter Meditation Circle. Hi, everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page. And if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. Secular Buddhism has only been around as a term for about 10 years, popularized by this podcast and the writings of people like Stephen Batchelor. Now we see many groups all over the world, and some in-person groups as well. Almost every week I hear from someone asking, is there a secular Buddhist group near me? My hope is that over the course of the next 10 years, I'll be able to say, yes, there is. Here's how you find it. In the meantime, other groups that have sprung up are beginning to get noticed and look to find connections with others. John Danvers is an artist, writer, and poet based in the southwest UK. John's work is rooted in contemporary inquiry, drawing on over 50 years of Zen meditation practice. He's the author of 3 books, Picturing Mind, Agents of Uncertainty, and Interwoven Nature. He is exhibited widely in the UK, Australia, North America. John's poems have appeared in poetry magazines and journals. He retired in 2012 from his role as Associate Professor in Philosophy and Art Practice at Plymouth University and is currently an Honorary Research Fellow at Exeter University. Since 2012, he's been the Buddhist Chaplain at Exeter University, and in 2016, John established Exeter Meditation Circle, a secular Buddhist group that meets on a weekly basis throughout most of the year. If you'd like to make contact with other secular Buddhist groups in the UK. Our guest today is John Danvers. John, welcome to the podcast. Glad to meet you.
And good to meet you too. Good to see you there.
So Jan and I have been speaking for a few weeks online, and in our email conversations, it's really interesting to hear there's another in-person secular Buddhist group, and we're going to get to that, and I want to hear more about that. But before we go there, John, why don't you tell us a bit about your background?
Okay, well, I first started doing Zen meditation, Zazen, in 1965, so a long time ago. I lived in what was a large mining and quarrying village in Leicestershire, in the centre of England, basically. And at that time, I knew of no Buddhist groups at all anywhere. But I'd been reading sort of beat poets, Jack Kerouac, Gary Snyder, people like that. Gary Snyder in particular, and references to Buddhism kept cropping up. And I thought, this sounds very interesting, and I thought I'd explore it a bit more. And by chance, I found on the shelf of my local library, which is way out in the middle of nowhere, a very small provincial town, the nearest library, that they had some, they must probably had one book on Buddhism. And in it, there was a translation of Dogen's essay, the Fukunza Zengi, which was, instructions. It's only about 2 pages long, but what I thought were very clear instructions into how to do Zen meditation. And I made a copy of these instructions, and I started and did my best. And I kept doing it fairly intensively for probably about 6 years on my own, with no contact with any other Buddhist or anything at all. I think I may have once wrote to the Buddhist Society in London, and I think I may have got a newsletter back from them, but that was the only contact I had. Then by that time I'd started at art school, and in the early 70s I was teaching and a fellow in painting and sculpture at various places. And then eventually we were in a town called Reading, which is about 60 miles, something like that, from London, 40 miles maybe. And I was helping to run what was an offshoot of the University Buddhist Society. And we used to run kind of mindful retreats at the weekends. And I'd still had, other than this group, I'd had no contact really at all with any other Buddhist groups. And one evening, a Soto Zen monk, Japanese Soto Zen monk, turned up to one of our meetings. And he was on sabbatical from Japan, from his temple, and was traveling around Europe, and had obviously seen a sign of some kind in the university. And he came along, and it was like being interviewed by the Dalai Lama, as far as I was concerned, because I'd never, I didn't know whether I was even doing the right thing in terms of Zen meditation. But we did what we usually do, which we sat and meditated for a while. And at the end of it, he said, "John, your sitting is very strong. Who your teacher?" And I couldn't think what to say. So I said, "Dogen." And he sort of laughed so much, he fell off his cushion. And he came a few more times, well, quite a few times. But every time he came, he said, "John, you got very good teacher." And so anyway, so that was by that time then I felt a bit connected to other Buddhists. This was in about 70, 72, 74, something like that. I went to a few retreats at Throstle Hole, which was, do you know Jiu Kennet, who started the group of Buddhist contemplatives? She had a monastery up in Northumberland in the north of the UK. I went on a couple of retreats there, and I was involved with various Buddhist groups at art school, university where I was teaching, and just carried on in that way. And I suppose I should have said that. So I've been an artist and a writer most of my life, and I've worked as an academic. So I was teaching philosophy and art practice for a lot of my career. And then I retired in 2012, and I've been the Buddhist chaplain here at Exeter University since then, and still working as an artist, writing stuff. I've got 3 books that I've done over the last few years, and working on another one. And that's my sort of background in a sort of potted form.
Keeping active. And you've been doing this for a very long time. And what that gives you, when I'm very interested in having in our conversation today, is an exploration of what you've seen over that time as someone you never became a monk. And so there's somewhere in there is a being you as you are, and also a Buddhist, and practice for a very long time. So I'm really interested to hear more about that. And maybe we can start with a question around around secular Buddhism.
Yeah, sure.
Of course, there are many different ways people may view secular Buddhism, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive or wrong. There are many different ways in which one might have a secular approach to Buddhism. And I'm curious how you see secular Buddhism as maybe being distinct from other forms like Zen or Theravada or other kinds of practices.
I mean, over the years, I suppose I've now gone to quite a lot of different groups in different places we've lived in the UK. And although I've got a lot out of those meetings, I always felt very slightly alienated by some of the ritualistic aspects of things, some of the what I consider to be kind of unscientific assumptions and so on that were held by people. And I also noticed increasingly there were more people like me. So we kept having, whichever group I was in, there would be people who would come along for a couple of sessions and then go away, and we wouldn't see them again. But occasionally I would meet these people again in another context. And, as one does, I just would ask them why they didn't come. And they would say, oh, I didn't like the bowing, I didn't like the chanting, or whatever it might be. So I felt there was a group of people, probably quite a large group of people, who wanted to practice a form of Buddhism which was very much rooted in our culture in the 21st century, or the 20th century earlier, that was trying to establish Buddhism as a mode of inquiry and a way of life which was rooted in our time and place. And without in any way being disrespectful to all the other traditions which have gone on, which, I see as incredibly important, and that the people who get benefit and nourishment from that, then that's excellent. They're performing a great function. But I did feel, that this was something that I wanted to work on a bit and talk to other people. And I suppose the other important thing is that, there's been a burgeoning interest here in the UK, as it has been elsewhere, in mindfulness and so on, in a therapeutic context. And I think that also generated a lot of people who come through some of those mindfulness programs, but we're looking to find out a bit more about where this was coming from. What they wanted to find out a bit more about Buddhism, which was they felt was obviously the source for a lot of this stuff, but that they hadn't had much contact with it. But again, they wanted a Buddhism that was cleared of a lot of the entanglement of culture and so on that have accrued to it. So in some ways, there's also this interest in what Buddhism may have been like before it was Buddhism. The kind of the earliest texts, as far as we can identify, of the Buddhist canon. So it's both somehow being rooted in the very distant past, the beginnings of, as far as we can tell, of Buddhism, but also rooted in our culture. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does, to me, a great deal of sense. And for folks who are new to this particular topic on this podcast, welcome to the conversation. Glad you're here. And an important aspect of what John is sharing here is something that comes up quite a lot in assumptions about what secular Buddhism may be. First, there is no one correct secular Buddhism. There are lots of different ways people approach it. And John, what you articulated was very much how my approach is and what we do at the Secular Buddhist Association, which is recognizing that we are not within a cultural context of 2,600 years ago.
Yes.
Many of us are not heritage Asian descent, so it's not a part of our family's heritage in our background. And by asking the question, what is this like for me in my cultural context? What is it like for someone who has a particular established worldview, maybe a scientific one? And again, not to dismiss others' practices, that's great. But for me to step in and wholly adopt what is someone else's heritage tradition is stepping into territory of potentially cultural appropriation, which we don't want to do. And
Yes.
so that's, please understand, it's not a disrespect of how others engage with it. That's great. It's recognizing that that's not what my background is and finding out what this might be for me. And for many of us, as you said, there are so many people who went to a session or two and never come back. How
Yeah.
many of those are like, yeah, I really like this, except that it's not quite a fit for who I am?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
what
Exactly.
secularism is intended to address, is what might it be like?
Yes. Yeah. It's funny, given the background, my history in a sense as I described it. For a long time, well, probably 20, 30 years, I always felt that I couldn't possibly be a proper Buddhist because I hadn't gone to Japan or China or Korea or whatever, and that I hadn't been formally accepted into the Buddhist fold somehow. And I should imagine for 30 years that was very much something that was always in the background. But more recently, I feel that actually it's given me a sort of different perspective on things. The fact that I'm a kind of homegrown Buddhist, that means that I've got a very Western rooted British perspective on this, which I think is probably quite beneficial to me and the people who I meet and, introduce to meditation and so on. They seem to get a lot from that.
Yeah,
That makes
just
sense.
today I received an email from someone who, through our contact form on the website, saying, for my entire life as a Buddhist, I thought I was just a bad Buddhist because I could never quite fit in right. And now this is opening up my eyes to maybe not. I'm just doing
Yes.
for who I am, and still authentically being Buddhist. Doesn't mean that we have to take on everything from someone else's belief system or
Yes.
cultural values. And there's nothing wrong with those cultural values. It's respecting that those are simply not ones that are ours.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly it. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about really one of our main topics here today is Exeter Meditation Circle. How did that get started?
Okay. Well, a few years back, I met someone whose background was in mental health, my good friend Glenn, and we would meet up, and he was describing his own experiences of having gone to another Buddhist group for quite a long time, but feeling the kinds of feelings that I've articulated. He had exactly the same feeling. And I said, well, I've been thinking for quite a while, because a number of people had asked me, is there a group in Exeter that meets that doesn't have all these other cultural features? And I said, well, at the moment there isn't. So, about 3 years ago, we decided, okay, we'll start a group and just see what happens. And I've got access to a very good space for meditation and so on. And so we started the group three years and a bit ago, and we meet on a more or less weekly basis. The sessions are very simple. We started with probably sometimes 3, 4, 5 people. Now we've got about 45 people on in the group as a whole, some of whom come every week, some come intermittently. But obviously, it's fulfilling a need. So, although there are about 8 groups in Exeter, which is only a small city, it's obviously fulfilling a need, and it's probably got more people coming to it now than many of the other groups, although I hope we're not, pulling people away from those groups. So that's how it started, and it's worked very well. We have simple sessions, very good discussions.
Well, I suspect you're not pulling people away. You're catching those who are stepping away, who
Yes,
never really connected with other centers. And
yes. Well, that's what I'm hoping. And the accounts that they bring, their stories are very similar to my own and Glenn's and other people. So it's obvious that that it's fulfilling a useful function in that sense.
Well,
Yeah.
let's talk about those sessions. So you discuss topics at the circle in addition to meditation practice, and I'm curious what some of the things you talk about and how do those conversations go? What's that look like?
Well, we basically our sessions we have a 50-minute guided meditation, which I usually do. Then we have sometimes a brief discussion about anything that's arisen in that meditation. Then we have 20 minutes silent meditation. And then afterwards, my idea at the beginning was that a discussion would just erupt, would arise naturally. I found very quickly that that wasn't the case. And so I started by suggesting things, and I would say a little bit at the beginning. And somehow that seems to have become much more regular than I thought. So usually in the end, I give a little talk, very, very short, just to kind of introduce a topic and to get things started. I suppose, a bit of my experience as an academic is quite useful in that way. And I always ask for suggestions for topics, and occasionally those come in. So we've looked at all kinds of things. We've looked at things that are more closely connected to meditation, to mindfulness, to other people's experiences. I suppose because I know a little bit more about Zen than anything else, we've talked quite a lot about that. We've talked about kind of therapeutic aspects of meditation practice. There are quite a few people who come who have got a background in mental health, as either academics or whatever, psychiatrists, psychologists. We've also looked at some of the relation. I'm very interested in the relationship between Buddhism, mindful meditation, and Western philosophy, I suppose. I see a lot of relationships between some aspects of Western philosophy and meditation and Buddhism in all sorts of ways, particularly the early Greek skeptics who, I was very, very interested in. And that's very useful because I think it makes people realize that even within a Western context, many of the sort of ideas, many of the insights that the Buddha articulated have been articulated in some way by people within our Western tradition. It's just that they've tended to be neglected or forgotten, or only scholars are interested in them. So I think that's been useful. And we've also looked a little bit at the kind of historical development of Buddhism, which I think also people have found very interesting and useful. So that's the kind of thing those are the kinds of things we've been talking about. But we're very open it's a lovely group of people, very diverse backgrounds. I suppose they've come for a lot of different reasons, as these groups often are. So we're often, someone will suggest something or make a point in a meeting, and then we'll follow that up by talking about it in more detail the next week and so on. I try and keep it relatively brief. So the sessions are only an hour and a half altogether, and sometimes they're quite a lot shorter than that. It seems to me if we've got nothing to say, we're just quiet and happy to be quiet.
It's one of the advantages of a meditation group. Silence is welcome.
Yes, indeed. Yes. And it's lovely to have, many people. I suppose one of the simplest things which people appreciate is the fact that silence is valued, to give value to something which many people are uncomfortable with. And it's lovely to sit in silence in a collective. We literally sit in a circle, and there's something very beautiful about that. There's something about the kind of harmony and a kind of understanding that you get, which is completely non-verbal. You sit in silence, and at the end of 20 minutes or whatever it is, you somehow feel a contact with those other people, even though you've not exchanged any words or ideas or whatever. And that's a very lovely thing. And I think most of the Buddhist groups that I've been involved in, I suppose that's one of the fundamental things that I think people take from it. That collective sense of kinship and friendship that emerges just by being quiet together and being present to. Is that?
That's beautiful. Thank you for talking about that, because it's one of the things that we keep hearing about, how contemporary groups are, they're very selfish and it's self-focused and that's all. And I'm like, well, you can't do anyone else's enlightenment, so look to the tradition if you're looking for roots to that. And that is counter to the experience anyone I have ever spoken with. And again, as I've mentioned, you over 400 interviews for a couple of podcasts.
Yeah.
It's exactly the opposite of what people describe, like you're describing here, is there is a connection that forms.
Yes.
And we form that online as well. It doesn't have to be in person. And that's part of a very strong part in group dynamic. That experience of sitting together, even in silence, can be very profound.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and that sense of connection that you can have by, allowing the ego, the self, to dissolve in some way, it's tremendous, and it's very reassuring and strengthening for people. They almost every week, we have comments, and people say, "Oh, I so look forward to this," and it helps me through the rest of the week. And it's such a simple activity, I mean, simple but not always easy.
We say that almost every week in our own groups.
Yes. Yeah.
So John, I'm curious about now your perspective of having been doing this for a long time, just Buddhism and practice. If you see this as a growing interest, if you're seeing more and more people having a little bit more intrigue and curiosity around a secular approach to Buddhism.
Well, certainly I do, yes. I mean, here in Exeter, one thing that I feel I would like to know more about is whether there are more groups in the UK, because it's very hard to find out whether there are or not. There's no network, as far as I'm aware, in the UK. And that was one of the reasons why, I contacted you about possibly being a partner site, so that if anybody else in the UK is looking, we might be able to begin to form a network here. The interest in secular Buddhism is growing here. And I think for all sorts of reasons, for people who are turning away from the kind of politics of alienation and conflict and so on, people who are very, very concerned about the environment and climate change and all those kinds of things, and people I mentioned before who've come more because they've been doing mindfulness courses or whatever to help heal their own state of mind or whatever. So all of these different reasons that people might have are feeding into it, and that's what's causing this growth, I think, in interest. And as I say, I'd thought that, like most of the Buddhist groups in this area, we would have half a dozen or 8 people or whatever, and it's greater than that, and it's very vibrant. There's a kind of dynamism to the stillness, which is lovely. So I do think it is a growing phenomenon here, and as far as I can gather, it's quite a significant movement in the States.
It is. What I'm finding with it is that we're just the term secular Buddhism, making that a crystallized thing, so that there's an anchor for attention, is really in talking with Stephen Batchelor about this, because we point at each other when people ask us who invented the term secular Buddhism. He says I did, I say he did, and I'm right. I have evidence. I can prove it. But socialization of this more broadly really started effectively with this podcast just a little over 10 years ago. So hearing people say now, just in regular conversation, "Oh, I'm a secular Buddhist," is delightful, and says so much about how just in this short amount of time, a single decade, this has now become quite common. And
Yes.
more and more is finding acceptance as people begin to hear what we've been saying all along, which is we're not trying to take away from the traditions. Most of us have grown up in the traditions. We value them tremendously, and we acknowledge that we may not be heritage Asian Buddhists. And there may be something else, another way for the Dhamma to manifest. And
Yes.
a lovely thing. That's not a bad thing. And so we're seeing it grow. Our friends in New Zealand are also really growing. Mike Slott is here in the USA, and Ramsey Margolis, New Zealand, are really driving that very strongly.
Oh, good. Yes.
Several groups on our site. There are at least 9 different countries that we know of that have satellite secular Buddhist groups. And for anyone listening to this, if you are not on our partners page, do what John did, reach out to me, use our contact, and we'd love to hear from you. And particularly
Yes.
if it's a group that is a secular Buddhist group, let us know so that we can let others know. I get letters almost every week from people saying, "Oh, is there a secular Buddhist group in?" And then they name a place. I'm like, well, not yet. We're just starting. It's very early yet.
Yes.
And in the meantime, find us online. We're as far away as your mobile phone for meeting and connecting and even practicing live with others. That's something we do right now until in-person groups are beginning to show up more and more.
Yes, that's great. I mean, and well, if somehow I can try and make contact with other groups in the UK, that would be lovely, because we could, have a network here, which we can then obviously link to yours and to others elsewhere, which would be an excellent way of, spreading the Dharma and continuing the work. It's interesting you mentioned Stephen, because I met Stephen and Martine in the late 90s when they were at Sharpen College here, which is only about 30 miles from where I am now. And I used to go to their sessions, and I ran a few workshops for them back in the 90s, about mindful meditation and the arts and things like that. So it's been lovely having that kind of contact. We've kept in touch ever since. But obviously that's Stephen's writings are really, and Martin's for that matter, but very much so, are really useful in relation to, what we've been talking about. I have a feeling probably the term secular Buddhism is not so well known here as it should be, in the UK. I'm not sure why, because, Stephen has spent a lot of time here, and, people have been on a lot of retreats.
He is noticeably English.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. His French connections are also very strong now, it seems.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, John, is there anything else, any parting words that you might offer to people listening to this, either about your group or just secular Buddhism in general? What else would you like to share?
Well, I suppose from, almost in a selfish way, if there are people listening who listen to the podcast who are in the UK, wherever it might be, and they want to get in touch, then, we've got a website. You've got a good link on your website. It would be great to get in touch, and then we can, help each other, either establishing groups or just connecting. That would be one very useful thing as far as I'm concerned. And I think, just generally, if people have a very open mind to how Buddhism in its many forms can develop interesting new forms within our culture, it's a very exciting time. It's an exciting time to be involved with it. I mean, I've always felt it. When people ask me, I always hum and ha and tend to say, well, I'm a sort of reluctant, skeptical, secular Buddhist. And probably there are a huge number of people who probably would describe themselves in a very similar way. Well, there is a home for all of those people, and it's the homes in the UK, the USA, New Zealand, Australia, wherever it might be. And what you're doing with the podcast and your online presence is a way of, welcoming people into that home.
Well, for those who are listening, if this piques your interest, know that the website John mentioned is meditationcircle.org.uk. I'll be linking to that on the episode page for this episode. So if you're someone who just listens to the podcast through your feed reader, you've got the address, you know where to find that. You can always come to the episode page for this episode as well. We'll have that linked there. Our guest today, John Danvers. John, thank you so much for being here. Wonderful to speak with you today.
And thank you for inviting me. It's great. Lovely. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.